whatever your other priority is, if you think the priority should be, well, I don't care about, sustainability. I want to cover my community. I want to innovate, or I want to have, I want to cover, a new community. It's like, you can't do any of those things if you don't exist. You can't innovate technically if you go out of business. You can't be diverse if you don't exist. There's like a whole bunch of things that you can't be if you're not there to begin with. And I think that's why we focus a lot on that. Not exclusively. Obviously, we do fund journalism. We do fund newsrooms in many cases that are doing really good work in communities around the country. But I think we feel like if we just did that, you're picking a very specific set of winners and letting everybody else just kind of fend for themselves.
Welcome to the Local News Matters podcast, where we explore pathways to stronger journalism, better businesses, and healthier communities. I'm Tim Regan-Porter, CEO of the Colorado Press Association. This episode, I talk with Jim Brady, Vice President of Journalism at the Knight Foundation. Jim oversees Knight's journalism portfolio and has played a key role in the development of Press Forward, a groundbreaking $500 million-plus initiative aimed at revitalizing local news across the U.S. We discuss the current state of local journalism and the importance of audience engagement and sustainable business models. Jim shares his optimistic outlook on how new infrastructures and funding models are shaping the future of local news. Drawing on his decades of experience in digital media, including roles at The Washington Post, AOL, and ESPN, Jim offers unique insights into the challenges and opportunities ahead for local news outlets. We also touch on the changing landscape of philanthropy and journalism, how new technologies are lowering the barriers for news startups, and the importance of maintaining a close connection with communities. If you like this episode and what we're doing more generally, please follow in your favorite podcast app, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and tell your friends about us. This is a side project and a labor of love, and your support means a lot. You can find past episodes, full transcripts, and relevant links, and sign up for our newsletter at localnewsmatterspodcast.com, or for lazy typists like me at lnmpod.com. You can also follow us on most social media channels at lnmpod. And now I bring you Jim Brady. All right, well, welcome, Jim. It's an honor to have you on the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks, Tim.
All right, so I know a lot of listeners will want to hear some more about Press Forward if they're not sick of hearing about it already. And so we'll get to that, but I want to set the table with talking about the industry more generally. And you and I have known each other for, I guess, a little over a decade now. I've brought you to Macon when you were, I think you had just launched Billy Penn maybe at the time. Fortunately, I've been able to stay in touch and catch up on everything from the early days of news on the web when I was doing tech at IBM and you were actually getting the Washington Post online, and a rich number of things a lot of things we could delve into. But I want to start with, I think this is a quote you gave the Seattle Times last year about really what it takes to be viable. And you were talking in the context of Press Forward announcements. And you said, everybody's got their challenges, but I do think there's a general sense in the industry these days that we're starting to come to some level of agreement as to what's required to build a viable business in local journalism. And we're all sort of moving towards that goal. Better audience engagement, diversified revenue, with philanthropy being a part of it, but not all. And we could certainly break that apart into many, many different conversations. But the first thing I would say, I found that statement hopeful or maybe aspirational, because sometimes I do wonder, are we trying to get the buggy whip industry working? Or, is there a fundamental problem here that, nobody's figured it all out, but you're pointing there to signs of progress and we're starting to figure out some of the pieces and put them together. So what gives you what's the reason for that optimism, and specifically, where do you see signs that is what's happening?
I think you see it in the growth of reader revenue, whether that's subscriptions or whether it's membership. I think it took us in journalism, God knows, 10, 20 years to really adjust to the fact that advertising was not going to be the path forward. And it's not, one of the things that's always frustrated me is when you talk to newsrooms who will say, well, sure, advertising is not going to be our future. It's going to be readership. It's going to be membership. It's going to be subs. It's like, so how are you changing how you operate to make that work? And they're like, well, what do you mean? And it's like, well, those are very different revenue streams, and you need to produce different kind of journalism. You need to produce different kind of, broader set of content, news, and information. You need to be thinking about how you're going to engage with people if you want them to give. It's not you're just going to throw a bunch of stories in front of them and cross your fingers and hope they pay. They need to have a sense of who you are, what you're about, what you stand for. And so, like, if you're going to change your business model, you need to change how you operate completely. And I think that took a while. So if it took a long time for us to get to the point where we realized the future is going to be more membership and subs, and it took another period of time after that to recognize that a lot of the activities had to change to make that work. And so but I do think you look at like the News Revenue Hub is now, I think they've generated $106 million in membership revenue for their members over the last 8 or 9 years, I suppose it is. And like they've done a great job helping people get membership up and running, and not only just from a technical standpoint, but how you ask for money and how often you ask for money and where on your site you put calls for money. And that gets to the second thing that gives me hope is I think there's a real like infrastructure for local journalism that is developing pretty quickly that I think is taking care of, I think the thing I don't think we talk nearly enough about when we talk about the economics of local news, it's expense. We always talk about how to make more money, and we all agree making more money is the important thing. Like, obviously, nothing substitutes for bringing in all sorts of new revenue and diverse revenue, et cetera. But there's this whole other side of the balance sheet that you got to look at too. And, as a guy who started Billy Penn 10 years ago now, I probably started that site knowing more about how to launch a digital news operation than 99.9% of people who start them. At that point, I'd been in the business 20 years and worked in big, small, and it was still a nightmare. It still cost a fortune to get a content management system up and running and to figure out how I was going to pay staff and how I was going to get insurance and copy, like a trademark and, just all of that stuff all of these companies that we worked for that frankly, a lot of us kind of pissed and moaned about, they did take care of a lot of the hard stuff. And you didn't really have to worry about that. You get to go write your stories or develop your audience strategy or go sell go sell membership, whatever it was. But at the end of the day, everything else was taken care of by this company you work for. And then all of a sudden you got to do all that yourself. And you really learn like, oh my God. And, now I think you're starting to see things like Newspack come up. And now Newspack is, got 300-ish websites using it now. And it's a content management system built and operated by WordPress, but it's developed specifically for news publishers. And there are now publishers using Newspack who are spending tens of thousands of dollars a year on their tech stack, who are now spending like $10,000 a year, like taking the cost down dramatically. And I think those things are kind of popping up across the landscape now. So I think we're headed toward a world in which not only do I think we'll continue to make more money by appealing to readers, but also we'll spend less money because we're going to plug into existing systems that are built for scale and built to keep the cost down. And I think, if you're a small publisher and you go from spending $80,000 a year on your tech stack to 25, I mean, for a huge company, 55K is not that big a deal. For a lot of the publisher sizes we're talking about, that is a life changer. And I think, and there are organizations that have taken that kind of cut, moving to Newspack. So you multiply that by a lot of the other things that are out there. There are great organizations like IndieGraph and Tiny News Collective that help tiny publishers, as the name says, get going. So I think you're starting to see this whole thing developing, and I think it's headed toward a period in which we're going to be able to get sites launched much more quickly and much more cheaply than we could 5 years ago. And this might be contrarian, but my attitude is if we can make publishing faster and cheaper, and that means 1,000 new sites can launch next year, I'd rather 1,000 new sites launch next year and 500 of them fail than 100 new sites launch next year and all of them succeed. Because at the end of the day, you're going to have a lot more new organizations out there if you make it easier to get started. And I think that's been the hard part, is people getting these things started. And I think we're headed past that. So that's why I'm optimistic. I think it's becoming more of a democratic system where you don't have to know somebody at a foundation or have a personal wealth to launch something. You can launch something because it's actually just cheap enough for you to get started. And and I've said this before too, there's two things I think you have to do to succeed in local journalism. You have to produce journalism your community cares about, and you have to figure out how to bring in enough money to keep doing it. All the other stuff, content management systems, CRM, legal support, insurance, like there are organizations that do those important things already, and you should plug into those and focus your energy on the stuff you can actually control.
Yeah. So, I think you're pointing to something I know Knight I think you've been moving this direction maybe even before you got there, which is towards shared services and infrastructure and ecosystem builders to really enable all of the players that can feed into that to flourish.
That's absolutely right. I mean, and it was before I got there. Jennifer Preston, my predecessor, did a lot of work in that space too. Jennifer did large grants to American Journalism Project, Report for America, Institute for Nonprofit News, Lion Publishers. And so I think we've continued with those and added a whole bunch of new organizations to it. And I know there are folks who don't like that and they wish we just gave more money directly to newsrooms. But I can't tell you how many times we run into a scenario, like you're sitting at a bar at a conference somewhere and somebody is complaining that Knight hasn't funded them. And then as the conversation goes on, they'll say something like, well, I mean, we wouldn't be where we are today if it wasn't for like the Tiny News Collective. And you're like, hey, we helped fund that. And then they're like, it's another great organization. Reporters Committee came in and did this amazing work to help me publish this story. It's like, we did, so it's like, that's the kind of thing I forget sometimes that, that even there are a lot of organizations out there that have taken advantage, I don't mean taken advantage in a bad way, but have utilized a lot of the tools that we have helped fund to help them run their business. So even if many of these organizations didn't get a direct grant, they've certainly gotten support through these other services. And I think that's the idea. The idea is we don't want to be the ones to say these 10 websites are the ones we think are going to win. Let's give them the money. We want to create a system where like winners can pick themselves. And I think, the Kansas City Defender is a site that kind of came out of nowhere 4 or 5 years ago because it did really, really terrific journalism. But I think they were able to leverage IndieGraph. I think it was IndieGraph to get started. And that was they had a path to starting to publish that might not have existed a couple of years before. And I love stories like that because there are all sorts of people out there who can cover their communities. It's just, we don't know who they all are. And what I love is an idea where a whole bunch of people are going to just step forward now because the tools make it possible. And I think that'll be a big benefit for local journalism nationally. And that's why we fund the way we fund. We're trying to create the most democratic, equitable system we can. And picking winners picking these 10 or 20 winners does not feel like it gets you to that.
Yeah, I've just recently read Raj Shah's Big Bets. Do you know that book?
No.
So for listeners who don't know him, Raj was one of the early employees at the Gates Foundation and was very instrumental in how they approach philanthropy. And then he went to USAID in the Ebola crisis. He was instrumental in that. And now he's the head of the Rockefeller Foundation. But his books has a lot of interesting points he makes that are relevant to business leaders, but certainly philanthropy. And one of the things he talked about was the work they did in Africa and the last mile problem and all the problems of infrastructure that you want to get money to the people on the ground, but if you don't have the infrastructure there, you're just putting a Band-Aid on a problem and you're not really solving anything. And sometimes I do worry about that for all of this money that's put into journalism. Yes, you want as much to go to newsrooms as possible, but you also want this to produce something that is more sustainable. And it's a delicate balance of how do you empower people at the ground level, but also make sure that you're not just filling a hole and not helping them grow. So
Yeah, it's an incredibly delicate balance. I mean, this is what I kind of hope the infrastructure piece helps fix a little bit, which is that 99% of news organizations that launch start by hiring reporters, because what's the point of hiring a business staff when you don't have any audience or anything to actually monetize? And so I think but that sets you up where you're kind of running against the clock to some extent, right? You're like, I'm now built an audience, but I've only raised X amount of money and that money runs out on X date. And now I have to make up enough business to make up for those costs. And so you're kind of starting from behind the eight ball a little bit. But the opposite is hard, to go out there and say, we don't produce any journalism yet, but give us money for this thing we're going to do. And so you kind of get trapped. And so you either have to decide to spend the money up front to build your own infrastructure and start writing stories, or try to, raise enough money before you launch. And they both are different. They're both tricky paths. I think the infrastructure piece just allows you to get in a position where you can do the basics much more cheaply and get launched much more quickly. And I think that way, even if it doesn't work, the opportunity loss there is not as big for you if you're personally putting money into something. A lot of people are probably willing to lose $25,000 to launch something and fail, and probably not a lot willing to lose $250,000 to launch something and fail. So So, I mean, and I don't mean to focus on the failure, but I mean, I think you go into starting something up knowing that the odds are not necessarily in your favor if you're starting something from scratch. And to make the cost of doing that smaller, I think we'll get more people in. And as a result, I think more people will succeed as well. But I think that's right. And I think then, and the other piece too is whatever your other priority is, if you think the priority should be, well, I don't care about, sustainability. I want to cover my community. Or I want to innovate, or I want to have, I want to cover, a new community. It's like you can't do any of those things if you don't exist. You can't innovate technically if you go out of business. You can't, you can't be diverse if you don't exist. There's like a whole bunch of things that you can't be if you're not there to begin with. And I think that's why we focus a lot on that. Not exclusively. Obviously, we do fund journalism. We do fund newsrooms in many cases that are doing really good work in communities around the country. But I think we feel like if we just did that, you would really be back in that scenario I mentioned before, where you're picking very specific set of winners and letting everybody else just kind of fend for themselves. And I think that's not what we're trying to create.
And to that point, and one of the things I've always admired about Knight Foundation, all the way down to the local teams and the community teams and the arts teams. And I think this stemmed from Alberto, sort of the culture he instilled. A lot of foundations are content to just write checks to the same people, and they're just there as a bank. And Knight, at least in the 12 years I've been dealing with them, that's never been the case. So you care a lot about effectiveness. And stepping aside from your grant making, when you look at the field, how do you think about encouraging innovation, so that not for its own sake, but so that you are building something that lasts and newsrooms are doing something different? What do you think is needed as publishers and editors and journalists? How should we be thinking about our own evolution?
Well, certainly, I think part of how we have to think about it is that we're all now in service of trying to preserve, those of us who work in local journalism are all in service of trying to preserve local journalism, not trying to preserve our own publication or our own, like we are and have been for a while now in what I have called many times the huddling for warmth phase of journalism, which is we're either going to work together to figure out how to deal with this problem, or we're going to wander off on our own into the blizzard. And I think we know how that story ends, right? I mean, I think right now the idea of competition, the idea that, that people wake up in a city like Chicago with a binary, I'm going to either read the Chicago Tribune or the Chicago Sun-Times, I think is pretty anachronistic at this point. I mean, people wake up in Chicago and scroll TikTok for an hour and a half, or go to YouTube and watch or binge something on Netflix. Like we're all competing with sort of all of the things that are out there in the world to do now. And we need to collectively sort of work to make local news a bigger part of that diet. And I think the way you do that is by taking the best ideas that you can find out there and trying to spread them as many places as possible. And I think you look at something like Documenters. Documenters is a great way to get citizens involved in covering meetings and publishing kind of accounts of those meetings, so that the citizenry is not in the dark about what's happening in a lot of important gatherings. And so like that's now in 8 to 10 cities. There's smaller, things like important, but like smaller in terms of the scale. We funded the Salt Lake Tribune chronicling how you go from a for-profit to a nonprofit, because a lot of people are going to do that probably over the next 10 or 15 years. And the path to doing that is not really that different for different organizations. You have to deal with the IRS one way or another, and there might be some differences here and there. But for the most part, they put a playbook together of how you do that, and that's shareable to everybody. So I think there's a lot of almost everything we fund, and pretty much everything actually, falls in the category of this is something that we like and we think other people can take advantage of, whether it's plugging directly into the system like a Newspack, or replicating it like a Documenters, or even just stealing the idea and doing it locally. So I think that's the whole idea of even when we fund individual newsrooms, it's often in this is an interesting thing they're trying. Let's see if it works. And if it does, then we'll try to communicate out why it worked and hope to encourage others to do the same. So for me, I just think it's about learning from everybody and putting aside this whole we're all competing with each other, because I don't think in any realistic way we can really claim there's a binary battle between people doing X or Y in most lives anymore. There's the bazillion things they could be doing, and we're just one of them in local news. And so, I mean, I think we're past that competition, though. I don't really get a lot of that. Like, we don't want to share anything anymore. Because part of the getting money from philanthropy is whatever you learn, you need to share. You don't get to take philanthropic dollars and like build the next, thing that you can turn around and turn into a huge business. You got to tell everybody what it is you did. We don't really get much blowback on that now. There's almost nobody who says like, "Oh, that's too bad because I really want to take this and do my own thing with it." So I think it's being open-minded. I think it's seeking innovation for the sake of the industry, not just for my organization. And that is not a problem anymore. There are still some pockets of that. We early on when we were looking at, because Knight, I say for the record, I think Knight believes the future of local media has to be both nonprofit and for profit. I don't think people realize that the percentage of media organizations in this country that are for profits about 80, 85. All commercial television, all newspapers for the most part. And so I think we feel like it's got to be both, but the commercial side can be a little trickier. It's a little trickier, like on the broadcast side for sure, where you have conversations with, TV station chains sometimes, and they like everything they hear kind of up until the point where you have to share this out. Not all of them. And we're talking right now to a few that don't do that at all, who are actually happy to share out what they're doing, because I think we feel like that's an important space for us to figure out. I think if you look at local news as in the US, the thing that gets discussed some ways the least is commercial broadcast. And yet, in most cities, it's still a dominant way people get news. And frankly, in most cities now, the largest news website in most cities is a TV station website and not the local paper anymore. So that they can't just be left out of this equation, but there's some changes they have to make as well in terms of a real openness to sharing information, which I think is starting to happen in some places, but it still can be a challenge there, but almost no place else.
Well, and one of the other problems I see, actually, Raj Shah had a quote, and he's talking about philanthropy, but I see it a lot. And I think, those of us who want to innovate, and I think there's a lot of innovation around the edges. And he said this about philanthropy, that sometimes they seem more focused on making the status quo more tolerable with, small improvements and an easy listening soundtrack. And I think one of the problems is I'm not sure we understand what the core problem is in terms of our business, but also in terms of our audiences. What is our core value proposition, and why do people need us? So where do you see? Think that's true? Do you see evidence, and where do you see signs of people really trying to get to the core and really innovate?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things I do see is that we still have an audience challenge for sure, and that there's a lot of organizations that do really important work that just don't have massive audience. And I think if you go back to what made like your average newspaper so incredibly powerful when it was at its height, was that you had this product that drove attracted hundreds of thousands of eyeballs every day, not because of the big investigative stories, but because of horoscopes and high school sports and theater listings and the police blotter or obits, whatever it was. And then when you dropped that investigative piece, and those eyes were already there. And so you had this like nuclear reaction of impact because it was eyeballs plus huge story equals change. And now you have a system of those things have just been separated. You have like a lot of newspapers that aren't able to do that level of investigative work anymore, but still have all of those other things I mentioned, obits, comics, et cetera. And across town, there's a nonprofit that's raised a bunch of foundation money that's doing the big J journalism, but like doesn't have much audience and doesn't get in front of the people reading the local paper. So you've like separated those two things, and like, how do we get those back together again in a way that can generate that kind of reaction? And one of the ways that has to happen, in my view, is that we can't just give up on the idea that sports coverage and arts coverage and small business coverage and real estate coverage are just things we have to give up on, and that we have to focus purely on capital J journalism, because capital J journalism really has never been the thing that built the business. Capital J journalism was always like something that was supported by this really great business, but it wasn't the reason people bought the paper. That was pretty clear from all the reader surveys that I ever saw at the Post. Was the reasons people got it were not that, but they appreciated it. But how do we go back to just making sure make sure people have coverage of all the things that matter in their community, so they can look at that paper in the morning for the same reason they used to, which is to figure out whether to bring an umbrella, should I bring, like basic decisions in life. What do I want to watch when I get home? Is the home team playing tonight? How did my kids' team do last night? Whatever. But like, I feel like we have to get to the point where we can rebuild that piece of it. And I think that's going to be the next phase of this, because I think we're doing reasonably well in the sense of, I think there are a lot of really good sites producing a lot of really good journalism in state capitals around the country, and holding powerful people accountable, getting results in terms of laws being changed. But I think like the audience is not as big as it could be, because the daily habit is gone, and the daily habit might still exist at that, again, that paper across town, but not where the story falls. And so I feel like we have this kind of weird little separation now that we have to figure out how to get back. And you look at something like the Daily Memphian in Memphis, which is trying to do all of those things. It's trying to do investigative work. It's covering sports. The Baltimore Banner has gone hard after covering sports. Now, both of those are paywalled sites too. And, you can have an argument with people about whether that's a good or, it's a good thing financially. Is it a bad thing? Because it means that people in those two cities, a lot of people just can't get those stories. But either way, I think like that rebundling, I think, is something that is something to pursue, with while at the same time acknowledging that the rebundling isn't just going to be on a website anymore. It's going to be on TikTok, and it's going to be, using a whole bunch of other tools. I don't think it's going back to this one property everybody puts their eyes on, but it's making sure the brand is in as many places with a broader range of stories as it can afford to do. So, but yeah, I mean, I innovation wise, I mean, I think there are, a lot of sites out there that are starting, like the two I mentioned, the Daily Memphian and the Banner, I think, that are trying to figure out how can you be all those things? Can you be all things to all people again in those markets, the way the Sun and the Commercial Appeal used to be? So, I mean, so that innovation, I'm interested to see how it plays out. I'd love to see that innovation also tried without a paywall, to see whether the kind of, control group there about what happens when somebody does all of those things without a paywall. That would require a massive amount of upfront funding. And so I understand why it hasn't happened, but it's something I'd love to see at some point.
Let's talk a little bit about press forward. So, for probably a small number of people in my audience who don't know what press forward is, how do you describe it? How would you describe it?
You could give a technical description, or you could just kind of say it's a campaign to save local news in America, and not put a real fine point on it, but that's kind of what it is in a lot of ways. I mean, I think it's really designed to get a whole bunch of both people who already think about journalism in the United States a lot like Knight and like MacArthur, but also get a bunch of people in who haven't really funded journalism, or haven't really been as engaged in the fight to save it, to try to get them in. And now at this point, we've got 61 different funders in, and, significantly past 500 million now in terms of money raised. But I think the idea here is to really just really make this a national effort in a way that it hasn't really been before, I think. And I think that's where it's been successful so far. I mean, so much of my travel and time right now is going into cities where they're thinking of doing a press forward, and meeting with groups of 10 or 20 funders and making the best pitch I can to start one in this state or that state, or this city or that city. And so far, the record's pretty good on getting them started. So, because I think there's a real desire there. I think people are they show up at the meeting wanting to say yes. So I'm not pitching myself as closing the deal perfectly myself all the time. I think I have an audience that wants to do it, and my job is not to screw it up, I suppose. But I think there's a real desire right now, and I think there's a few reasons for that. I think there's a sense that a lot of funders who fund democracy now believe that journalism is part of that. That journalism used to be a kind of a thing that you could, if you were standing in the democracy tent, you could sort of see journalism from there, but it wasn't in it. And now I think a lot of funders believe that journalism is an essential part of democracy, which obviously I believe as well. So some folks are coming in on that. There are others like Kaiser Family Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson, who are focused on a particular topic area, but at a local level, and want to fund in that space, which I think is wonderful. And then you have funders, the third group of funders I feel like we've gotten in that I think is an interesting group, are kind of the journalism afraid. Like this is I think when you work in it your whole career, like we have, I think you kind of look at journalism. We know what it is, and we know how to evaluate it. And we forget that if you don't come from this little weird world we live in, like trying to evaluate a journalism proposal is not that easy. You got to know who the person behind it is. You have to know that their, journalistic chops are legit. And it's not as easy as it sounds in a world rife with pink slime sites and people starting sites with very legitimate sounding names. I mean, it's, we used about 20 words to name newspapers in this country for 200 years. So if you just put any two of them together and put a hyphen between them, it sounds like it's a legitimate site, right? The Register Bulletin or the Bulletin Journal, and a lot of these pink slime sites just have these very innocent sounding names and look like news sites. And then the more you dig in, the more you realize there's a political actor behind it, very subtly in many cases. I think people have this misnomer about pink slime sites, that they're all really obvious. They're not. A lot of them are actually quite skilled at what they're trying to do. So if you're a funder and you don't really know journalism, you look at this and you think like, I think I could make the right call here, but the price of making the wrong call is significant. And so maybe I just won't make any. And I think a lot of those funders now think, hey, there's all these people funding journalism. A lot of people here do this, have been doing this for decades. Like, this is the time to get involved because we can like lean on them as part of the collaborative to say, help us evaluate some of these sites that are coming to us for money, or even just help us figure out how to fund journalism. Because I think there's also and we've seen this a lot at the local level, the immediate instinct of a lot of people in a local press forward is to want to fund like sites locally, and they can and should do that. But you also could do things like create a FOIA fund, or create a legal defense fund, or fund a new launch of documenters. There's a lot of things you could do that isn't give money to X site. It's to support the overall ecosystem in your state or your city. And I think that's the kind of counsel and help that people like Knight and MacArthur and Democracy Fund and who have been funding journalism a long time can really help those funders with. So that's what's exciting about it, is all these new names that pop up on the list of people funding press forward who either haven't funded journalism much or not at all. And I think that's really what I'm excited about.
Yeah, I think, and that's what I hear from the national funders as they've talked about Press Forward, is that hope to really bring in that new money all the way down to local community foundations, et cetera. And you just pointed to one big challenge of that in the evaluation. And I know there used to be a problem of just awareness of the problem, that particularly if you've got a newspaper that's been around for over a century, the advertising side, the publisher doesn't want the public, they don't want to talk about to the public about the challenges. The funders need to know that, news is in crisis and democracy is in crisis, and they're related. So that's one problem. Are you seeing that as less and less of a problem? Or are people still surprised to know that we're struggling in this
No, a
industry?
lot of people are surprised to know. I mean, you saw the I think it was Gallup, and maybe Pew. I'm sorry, I should really know that considering. But there was this research from a couple of weeks ago that 63% of Americans still don't know local news is in crisis. Now, I have a somewhat, I don't know, controversial is not the right word, but a somewhat counterintuitive. I mean, I do think a lot of that's our fault. I don't think that's the public being stupid. I think we spent a lot of years, I think, not being completely transparent about the problems we were going through. I don't know if it was pride or what it was, but there's way too many examples of stories of, a news organization laying off 20 people and kind of couching it as part of our digital transformation. And it's like, no, you getting rid of 20 people because you can't afford these 20 people anymore because you're having economic problems. And I feel like if we had been a little more transparent about that, the same way we demand transparency of other organizations that we cover, we call them out on it when they're not transparent. I'm not sure we've done a very good job of being transparent ourselves. And, the big example I use all the time is, I don't think, and I'd be happy to see many, many examples of this, but I just doubt there are many. I would love to see examples of newspapers writing stories over the last 10 years that explained why the newspaper that people were reading now costs 3 times as much as it used to, but it was 1/3 as big. Like you and I both know why that happened. The revenue shifted from advertisers to the audience. But I don't know that a lot of papers wrote those stories explaining why that happened, because I do think there's a lot of people who have real affinity and love for those brands who would have understood that and accepted it if they had just been kind of told that. But I feel like the stories are always a little mealy-mouthed, a little bit about this is rates going up because of, delivery rates have gone up. And it's like, that's not really the story. The story is the revenue is transferring from one side to the other, and you are bearing more of the cost of this thing that, frankly, you were paying a fraction of what it was worth before. And I don't think we did a very good job of explaining the shifts in our own industry in a way that could have brought readers along in a way that made them more sympathetic and more feeling like they were part of the solution. Instead, we I felt like wrote these kind of BS stories about our problems. So I do think we are part of the reason that number is 63. Now, that number was 75 a couple of years ago. So clearly, like, it's getting through to more people. And I think that's partially because there's more transparency now about the challenges of the industry, even at the individual site level. I mean, I remember when we were raising money for Billy Penn in 2017 or 2018. I mean, we were pretty clear. It's like, hope we know you like what we do, but we will not be around in 2 years if we're not able to raise this amount of money. And I think that's an appeal that works when people really like what you do, and you're basically telling them this is basically table stakes. We're not going to be here, that they're willing to give. And I think more of that from the larger organizations that were going through this, I think would have benefited them. So yes, I think that number is frightening, but I also don't want to fall into the trap of saying it's like, how do these idiots not know that we're in trouble? I think we didn't do a great job of telling them.
And I think one of the other obstacles there that's also related to that transparency problem and that I think we need to be transparent now is we're not going back to the old model. And I mean the 500,000 from Press Forward, $100,000 over 5 years, something like I forget how many billion's been sucked out of the industry. Duck and I actually did this on the napkin when he was in Denver. And so the Press Forward is like 1.5% of what we've lost. And, so we're not going back to newsrooms with hundreds of people in a city the size of Denver, or dozens of people in the city the size of Macon. And community foundations need to understand that. Readers need to understand that. You're not going to get a newspaper that's thick as a phone book on Sundays. And so, yeah, we've got to talk about that, because the solutions going forward might be like you were talking about early on, these tiny news sites and these very, niche, focused journalism outlets. I mean, I hope we still have the Memphis paper that's doing the whole, the bundling, but we're going to have, this is sort of a all hands on deck, all solutions welcome moment.
Right. And look, neither the Banner nor the Daily Memphian, I think, at its height, have anywhere near what those papers had at their height. I mean, they're doing terrific work, but they're not trying to replicate those old sizes. I would say the one thing about that is I do think we have to also set the goal properly as to what we're trying to get back to. Because if you take your typical 300-person newsroom in your average mid-American city from 20 years ago, I do think the real question is how many of those 300 people were feet on the street in the city covering the city? Because it was not 300, right? I mean, you had a massive amount that back when you were doing print publications, you had a massive amount of staffers who were production focused, a lot of copy editors, a lot of production folks. You also had a whole bunch of special sections that got spun up because there was a lot of revenue attached to them, but they weren't really inherently local. Like there might be a local story or two in there, but the truth is you had travel and health and home and a lot of these sections because they threw off a lot of cash. And so take those people off the list, you're probably getting that 300 down to maybe 100 that were actually out on the street of the city. So let's aim for that. Let's not aim 300 silly anyway. Like we're never getting back to that, but that shouldn't even be the bogey, right? The bogey is to try to get back to getting enough feet on the street to cover the things we used to cover. And even if we don't get all the way back there, if you could get 75%, 60% of the way back to that, it's not terrible. Because I think people go, oh my God, there's 30 people covering Cincinnati and we used to have 300. It's like, that's not really the right number though. That 300 is not the right number. That number may be 90 or 100, and then the gap's a lot smaller. Now all that said, I mean, that means there's fewer copy editors too, and that comes with its own trouble. But I do think like when you see these graphs, you see them sometimes on Twitter or something like, oh my God, this newsroom used to have 600 and now it has 100. And this one used to have 700, now it has 200. Yeah, those numbers are accurate, but they're sort of reflecting a newsroom of a different era that we're not trying to rebuild anymore. So I think it's like, what are we trying to rebuild is more important than trying to get back to some number that was always a little bit bloated anyway. So, but yeah.
If Press Forward's wildly successful, what do you hope comes out of it? At the Night Media Forum, I can't remember if it was you or John Palfrey or someone threw out, I hope it's $1 billion in the 5 years. But beyond just the number, and just more fundraising and from philanthropy, what do you hope happens as a result of all of this?
A bunch of things. I mean, one, I hope it creates a more of a continued culture of philanthropic funding for journalism, not as a full solution to it. I think there's got to be a for-profit commercial solution that still is powered by reader revenue. But I do think in communities, if more community foundations realize that this is an important part of what they fund, and if for no other reason, I mean, I think Alberto, frequently, and it's a line that has been prominently requoted, but whatever your first funding priority is, journalism should be your second one, which is that if you care about education or racial equity or climate, like good journalism about that topic is going to do you a lot of good. So, support that as well. So if that takes, if just people more clearly see what a community looks like when it doesn't have a local news source, get back in the game. I think that's one takeaway. And I think part of the educational piece of this is to get people more comfortable doing it without maybe this large Press Forward structure being here permanently. I think the second is I do think the combination of this infrastructure that Knight and others are helping build and all this extra money in the system, I think is going to lead to a real surge in new organizations kind of launching and getting up and running. And I hope that because of the stuff we talked about earlier with infrastructure, a lot of them will survive. And it's a whole new beachhead of sites and organizations and cities around the country that start to plug some of the news deserts. That would be great. But I just think it's changing how journalism is seen in the philanthropic landscape. And, but I think it's also helping it rebuild its this surge can help it rebuild its economic base in a way that nothing has really been able to before because the amount of money was just a lot less than it is right now. Now, with that, you have Meta, not doing journalism anymore, and that took a chunk of money out of the system too. So it's not all new money. It's also there's some money that came out that this is filling and topping more, putting on more on top of. But so it's not all good news in the funding space. But I do think those are the two big goals, and and more new sites, more of a commitment to fund infrastructure long term. And I think the third one is just showing that this infrastructure model really does work in terms of like feeding a whole new ecosystem for local news. Remember, you go back 20 years, everybody was on their own tech stack. Everybody was doing completely everything with, pretty much doing their own thing. And now you had this period where everything had to get rolled up, often inside really large corporate cultures. And I think now so it's like, it's interesting to watch the evolution of the last 20 years. And now I think you're in a world where it's just like, you have to be on the same back end systems because it's just so much more cost efficient. And if you look at something like a Newspack, your ability to create a site that looks completely different than every other site on Newspack exists. So you're not stuck in some templated world where you have to publish this and that. You basically can make your site look however you want. So the tools that are out there are also flexible. They are shared, but they're not cookie cutter, which I think is important. And I think a lot of the way a lot of the corporations and news saved money in the last 15 years is they had to cookie cutter everything. And that's not a criticism. That was necessary financially to keep them up and running. And I think we're headed into a system now that's not cookie cutter, but is standardized enough to keep costs down.
And I want to ask you a question that I think we asked when you were in Denver at a gathering that Melissa Davis had put together. Sort of what keeps you up at night. And Teresa Gorman jumped in with the first time I had heard this phrase, the Mackenzie Scott effect, that because of high profile philanthropy, you put money in and then others stop giving. And in fact, just this week, I heard about a small foundation who said they're national in scope. They said, we're not going to give to anybody in a Press Forward local chapter because they've got that taken care of. So it seems a very real concern. Are you worried about that particular?
Yeah, I think there's always the unintended consequence probably isn't the right word, but always the things you don't see coming. And one of them was certainly like there was a perception that philanthropic funding stopped last year while Press Forward was being put together. And I can certainly say we put out more money in 2023 than we did in 2022. So it wasn't us that stopped. And I don't think it was others who stopped either. But I think but people did hear is I'm interested in this, but I want to wait till Press Forward gets launched. I do think that did happen. And I do think that pushed some decisions out in a way that probably was not positive for some folks. But yeah, I hadn't heard that particular example. And I wish whoever that was would dig in a little bit more because there's not massive amounts of money in some of these local Press Forwards. And I think that'd be good. The way I would view it is those are 25, hopefully soon 50 cities in which really good, interesting things might come out of. And that should be a good lead gen for a national foundation to say, hey, that's a really cool idea. I'll jump in. Thank you for letting me know that this great thing was happening in your market, not as a place to not fund anymore because somebody there is already doing it, because the variation in how much people are spending in local Press Forwards is huge. There's some where there's not that much money in them. And yeah, the goal is to get a foundation, even if they don't put up a massive amount of money out of the gate, is to get them to recruit other funders so that number goes up. So I would certainly, not wish anybody would just sit out the Press Forwards. But there's a lot of things that keep me up at night. One is just that we have an audience problem and there's a news avoidance challenge that we can't ignore. Like we can fix the infrastructure and we can get more sites up and running, but they're not going to make it if they're not powered by the actual interest of human beings. And I think, we've seen a lot of decline in the last couple of years of audience, although not significantly by the way of revenue. So that's encouraging, which is, it shows, I think, the shift that the reader revenue model has had, which it just shows that if you can make a really important difference in somebody's life, I will give you money. And that's not based on how many times I went to the site last year. It's often based on what impact you're having in my community or on my life. And so the fact that traffic could go down dramatically and revenue does not go down with it is a sign of a new era, which I think is great because in the early digital era that we lived through, it's like, page views went down. The only way you could keep the revenue from going down was jam more ads on the page because your revenue is completely tied to the ads units. And so page views were revenue in a sense. And, we've gotten away from that world now, which is great. You can get 1,000 people to read your story instead of 1 million. But if it's a really important story and 500 people say, I'm going to write a check to keep this work alive, then we're all better for that. So I do think that's the encouraging thing. But the fact that the audience is declining is a problem. And I don't think the audience can keep declining without revenue at some point taking a hit. That feels inevitable. So I do think we have an audience problem. And I do think we have to think about some of those other coverage areas that I think people look at as not important. They're not, it's not investigative to cover arts, or it's not investigative when I cover local sports, but that is what gets people to come to your come to your site or your TikTok feed every day. And I think we do have to be cognizant of the fact that not everything has to be a deep piece of investigative journalism to count these days. You need to get people engaged in other things in your community. And so so I do worry about audience. I do worry that we're a little too niche and a little too boutique right now, in the sense that that really important work that's being done is not enough in and of itself.
One of the other things that came up at actually this year's Night Media Forum, and Joaquin Alvarado a couple years ago at our conference was talking about philanthropy, and he's talking to a group of ethnic media publishers and talking about some foundations coming into a city to do something new and didn't even talk to the Black publication there. And then Mitra brought this up on the panel at night that, if you're going into a city, please go talk to the legacy outlet first. But interestingly, after that panel, I was talking with a leader in philanthropy who works with a lot of publications. She herself is Black. And she said, I don't know, those are the publications I avoid because they're not interested in innovating, and they're really hard to work with. And so there's definitely some challenges there with any legacy media. So how do you think about balancing all of those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to make any kind of broad statement about anything in this business and have it really hold. Like, right? I mean, it was the first significant grant I made when I got in the job was to create the LMA, or the Night LMA Bloom Lab, which is the funding of a sort of a technical, editorial, and business transformation of 26 publishers around the country. But we didn't just pick the top 26 cities and go there. You had, these were organizations where the CEO themselves would show up on the calls to talk about what their what their digital transformation was going to be like. There was a commitment from the top that this was going to happen, and you fund those. Now, not every organization that applied to be part of the Bloom Lab passed that test. There were others who it was clear we're not ready to make the transformation. And in those cases, there was not an investment made. So I do think you're going to run into that everywhere. There are progressive and non-progressive legacy organizations. And so when people say, well, we should support legacy organizations more, it's not as a broad statement, it doesn't really mean anything. But I do think, and so it really depends on the city, but I will proudly say the Bloom Lab has been a massive success in terms of both it's revenue, audience growth. It's bringing down the cost of the tech stack. It's won on all fronts. And it's really changed the trajectory of the publishers who were a part of it in a way that I know I'm personally really proud of, because these are organizations that have been in families for 5 or 6 generations and are absolutely essential to their communities. They just were, like many legacy brands, were just behind on the digital transformation. But I think, you can find people who really want to make that shift. There's a lot of news organizations out there, that are legacy based or family owned, that really, really want to figure this out. And I think it doesn't take that long to figure out whether they're serious about it or not. So I think, to Mitra's point, you have the conversation to find out, and you might find out in some cases that you're not able to work with them because they're just not ready to make the shift. But I think more often than not these days, you'll find that they are. They just need somebody to help them figure out how to do it.
And now I want to reference something you wrote, I guess it's been 4 years now, for your 2020 predictions for Neiman Lab, which was really all about trust and bubbles. And you said, we forget there was a time when good journalism penetrated ideological bubbles. So why doesn't it now? And you talked about, we're not trusted. We haven't moved digitally. We've done a poor job of communicating with our audience. Some of the things we've already talked about. What kind of progress have you seen along those lines? I mean, clearly, trust is a huge problem nationally. The surveys show local news is faring better, but it's not going in the right direction.
Yeah, it's trending better. I mean, I think it's even up a little. I think it might have been up from the last survey, but it's still in the 30s, I think. Whereas national's 10 or 15 or something. So, but at some point, that's being better than national news at a trust level is not exactly a not exactly something to pop champagne over at this point. So no, I mean, I think we still have a lot of progress to make. I mean, I think one of the areas, I mean, I do think we're in a bubble. I think journalism's always probably less so now. I think when you were in the ad business, you could be more in the bubble because your money wasn't coming from the audience. So like you didn't really have to talk to them very much. And it's kind of interesting because while obviously we all talk about those as the good old days when the margins were huge and the newsrooms were massive and the expense accounts were larger, at the same time, like the bad side of that wasn't even just the collapse of it, but the bad side of that really good period was I feel like there was a certain distance from our audiences that grew in there because that daily conversation with your audience wasn't necessary because they weren't paying the freight. And I said many times before, like just joked about the fact there's a reason you could put a quarter in a newspaper machine 20 years ago and take all of them. And it's because that wasn't where the money got made. If they were perfectly fine if you took all of them because they already got the money from the car dealers and the banks and the department stores and all those places. So there was, I think, a bit of I said before that a lot of metro dailies, I feel like in that period kind of wanted to be of the people. They just didn't really want to be with them. And I think like that's changed dramatically, but I still think there are still organizations that I think get so focused on kind of what happens inside the building that they're still not great at engaging with the audience in a way that makes them feel like they're part of something. And I think that's the shift. I do think all organizations are talking to their readers more because they understand that's where the revenue is coming from. But then there's that other piece beyond that, which is getting to know them at sort of an individual level, which I know sounds crazy, but I'll tell you that when we did Billy Penn, when we were trying to grow membership, if you get somebody to come to an event, the odds that they would become a member skyrocketed. I mean, people really do want to engage with brands where they feel like they know somebody or have a feeling about the quality of the people behind the byline in a way that they just didn't 30 years ago. So I do think more organizations are getting there. I do think it's penetrating the bubble a little bit, but I still think that, we're not talking to them enough to recognize that there's an awful lot of things they want to know about that we still don't cover. And some of that's because we don't have the bodies, but I do think there's still more need for landscape analyses and really deep reader surveys on what people want. Because I think most readers would probably say I would rather have, coverage of high school sports than investigative. I'm not saying they should, because investigative is amorphous. It could be about anything. Like, I think they have this desire to know more about arts and sports and the things we talked about earlier. I'm not saying they should do that because investigative is crucial, but like the average reader doesn't really know how to define investigative in a way that journalists do. And I think we have to be better at explaining to them like why investigative matters, but we also have to be open to the idea that we should create beats and cover things that they really want that we might either look down on or feel like isn't really important. So I do think we have to have much more of a dialogue and get out of the rarefied air of everything we do has to like take down a mayor or put somebody in jail. And I think we want to do all of those things. But man, that day-to-day TikTok stuff is just crucial because I think it helps penetrate the bubble, right? I mean, I'm not bullish on the state of national news right now, to say the least. And I feel like, the antidote to like the frustration people have with national news to me is more local news. Because I feel like every brain cell that is now focused on national news, if you can convert it into one that's thinking about local news, I feel like we become a smarter society because so much of national news you have no control over, you have no connection to. All you can do is get angry about this policy happening 1,000 miles away that no one's going to ask you about and you're going to have very little say over. Whereas in your backyard, you've got school policies, transportation, you've got bonds. There's all these things that you actually can get involved in a way at your local level. You just can't at a national level. But coverage of that helps activate people's interest in those things. And so I do think one of the ways, we have to keep penetrating the bubble is we've just got to get back to doing some of the daily work of covering communities in ways that are not necessarily as sexy as the big investigative piece. Cause I just feel like that's a missing link. So that'll help us get out of the bubble a little bit. But I do think, like the journalism Twitter, I think was probably some of what I've referenced in that column. I'm not sure if I did, but I know I thought it, which is just there's sort of this Twitter journalism or people in journalism debate each other all day long about it. And I feel like I'm not sure how helpful that is. I stepped out of that debate a long time ago just because I realized like I'm spending too much time on Twitter. I'm talking to people just like me all the time in terms of like, it felt like I was not growing much at all in that. So I stepped out of it. So I think more people are. I mean, I really do think since 2020, there's been some progress on this front because I think more journalists have decided spending all day on Twitter is not healthy for them either. And So anyway, I think we're making progress, but I still stand by most of that, and I certainly stand by it from the time I wrote it because I was especially frustrated about it at that point.
Well, I think a lot of the trust solution that you're getting at with the bundle and writing about, the sports and culture comes down to a sense of, do you care about the city and are you part of the city? And there's a story I've recounted from you, and so you can correct me on the specifics that I've been mistelling. But you told this story. Was it a newsgeist or news foo, or maybe it was a Scripps entrepreneurial thing, something out at ASU. And you were recounting one of those events at Billy Penn. And I think it was a city council member or somebody came up to you and said, "Boy, you've hit us hard, but at least I know you care."
Yeah.
And that's an indictment that our legacy publications people have the sense that just doesn't care about the city. They're there for clicks or the gotcha, to get the mayor booted out or something to burnish their own credentials.
He just basically knocked on the door of our office in our co-working space and said, "I don't like a lot of the things you have written about me, but I respect how much you care about the city." And like you could just tell from the way it was written that these were people who had passion about Philadelphia, and and I think even when we picked the tagline for the site, for a better Philly, like I know it's some of my friends in journalism say like, you can't say that. It's like, why not? It's like, I mean, who wants it to be worse? So and it's like, and by the way, what's a better Philly, right? Everybody's going to have a slightly different answer to that question. What we're saying is whatever fight for what you think will make Philly better. And this will be the place where we can air those ideas out and debate them. But like, I don't think there's anything controversial about saying we'd like to live in a better city. We just can all define it differently. And I remember that very well because I wasn't actually, I want to say I wasn't there, but the team that was there like turns around and sees this guy who they've written an awful lot of bad things about standing in their doorway. And it's like, uh-oh. And instead they got kind of, yes, I'm going to remind you that I don't like these stories, but I'm also going to compliment you because, you guys are show up and you're here and so that was a moment I was really proud of. And I think that's all really important. And I think the other thing too is, I do think there's just so much in a local community that binds people in a way that just does not happen at the national level. I mean, I think when you're stuck in traffic on 95, I mean, like nobody's thinking about whether the person in the car next to you is a Republican or a Democrat. You're just all frustrated. You're there and you all want to know what the solution to this constant traffic problem is. Like this, and you're all rooting for the local sports team and you all want to get out of town when the hurricane's coming. And, there's a local kid, going to America's Got Talent. If you're not rooting for them, you're just a jerk at that point, right? I mean, at some point, you just like there's so much that binds people locally that doesn't have to be ideological. And I think that's why I think more local news is good for the soul because it's not stuff that's going to make you angry all the time. Yes, there's going to be political issues locally that'll get you ticked off, but so many things we deal with at local are just not automatically drive people to rage where it just feels like so much a national does, partially because the organizations, especially on the cable TV side, or that's the job. The job is to drive division because division drives revenue. And so as long as division drives revenue, we're going to have division. And so I think that's why I just think this fight for local is so important because by the way, local, when you can produce a hell of a lot more local stories, some of that stuff will bubble up to a national level too. And I think that's probably a good thing as well, is replace some of this airtime of people screaming at each other with actual stories that could require the use of a reporter sometimes would be nice, but that might be a pipe dream. But in general, I just think more local news is the answer to a lot of our national news problems too. But we've got to build an economic system that allows more of that to happen than it does today. As we've discussed most of this conversation, I see a lot of positive signs there, but there's a lot of miles ahead of us on this road.
So we're past 12:30. Do you have 10 minutes to do the rapid fire or do you need to jump?
Sure, I can do rapid fire.
So the first question you pretty much answered, but I'll see if you want to summarize it. Compared to a year ago, do you feel more or less optimistic about the future of local news?
More.
What if you had to give 3 reasons? What would your top reasons be?
I think the improved infrastructure is allowing for better lower expenses, I should say. 2, I think the system is going to start allowing for a lot more new sites to get up and running, which I think is a good thing. And 3, the philanthropic surge.
Does AI fill you with more hope or dread when it comes to journalism?
Hope, because I feel like we have a long history, and I'm not sure how rapid fire this is, but I'll give you the 1 minute. Is like I feel like most of my 30 year, I'll be 30 years in digital next April. So, and I feel like our history in digital with technology is to pretty much treat everything as a threat first and an opportunity second. And I think that we have never succeeded because of that. And I think at AI, we either have to, yes, there's lots of threats. Yes, there's copyright. Yes, we got to figure all that out. But my God, AI could do so many things for local journalism if we start with the idea that there's a lot of positive there. And I think so far we're off to a better start on that. I hear more journalists talking optimistically about what AI can do for their own operations, yet while still worrying about that other stuff, but not making it the focus.
Do you have a favorite piece of advice you've been given or you like to give?
Boy, that's a good one. I think the one I try to live by certainly is, I mean, it's not a journalism one, it's more a management one, but it's basically when somebody is in front of you and they're yelling at you 90% of the time, is my father's advice. 90% of the time when somebody's in your face about something, it's about them. It's not about you. So if you can just not react with the requisite anger and you can just really listen and to hone in on what the problem is and try to solve it, you will A, keep yourself a lot more chill, but two, you'll solve more problems. So it's try to stand up in the face of anger or frustration, just deal with the problem. I only lose my temper during jet games. That's pretty much it.
Is there a piece of common advice or conventional wisdom that drives you crazy in its oversimplification or just wrongness?
God, so many. God, I'm trying to think of one right now because I say this all the time. Like that makes no sense to me. It's well, the one that I remember that I never liked is 80% of life is showing up. I'm not sure what that even means. I mean, I've showed up at lots of things and been useless, and I'm not sure that solved 80% of the problem. But no, that there's a lot of them. If I had more time, I could have thought of a good one on that one. I'm sorry, I'm not coming up with a better one.
Do you have a favorite failure of yours?
Yeah, I mean, I think a favorite. I mean, one that I learned a lot from, even back at AOL for the 2000 Olympics, we did research that showed that most readers said they did not want to know what had happened in the Olympics until it was on NBC. And the time difference made it so we actually created a site that only had what NBC had shown on it, and another one that had what had happened in real time. And 80% of people said they would use the one that was the NBC version, and in reality, 90% of the people used the one that was live. And so it was a complete failure to do it that way, but we based it completely on reader research. But also, a lot of us saw that research and said we didn't believe it, but we went with it anyway. So the lesson there was no matter what you see in research, like never let your gut completely go away. Like the gut there would have been a good counterbalance, and we probably wouldn't have gone as far as we did to build a whole other site. So we had a lot of conversations about it. We kept focusing on the research, the research, the research. Well, that's what it says. So let's just live by that 100%, even though there was a part of all of us that said there's no way that many people want to read it that way. And we were right, but we did all the wrong things. So it's like mix of data and instinct is a good way to go forward. Don't put too much in either.
As a field, we've been increasingly reporting about the mental health crisis in this country, and particularly since 2020, and actually since the whole journalists as enemy of the people thing. I've been very worried about the mental health of our field, and we just drive people out. So, two questions: one, for yourself, what do you do to maintain your sanity? And then, do you have advice for leaders on just taking care of your team and making sure that we all stay mentally healthy?
Yeah, I mean they're good questions. I mean, I think in terms of taking care of the team, I think I mean it's I've long said, even whenever if I get asked the question, which I do time to time, is what's the best job you've ever had? My answer is usually actually I quit when it becomes a job. Like I really feel like most of my career I've been really lucky in that I've done things I've really liked doing. And so maybe that still means it's a job, but in my definition of it, that just means I'm lucky enough in my life to do something professionally that I really like doing. And I think I just know myself well enough to know that I have to be in a position where I like doing what I'm doing, because otherwise I just can't stay in it. And it would be no fun for anybody to work with me in that scenario. So I think like managing the team, I think every place I've ever worked, I've tried to do two things: be as transparent as I can about what's going on, even sometimes at my detriment. But I feel like a team functions really well when it knows as much as it possibly can about what's going on around them. And two, just try to make it as fun as possible. I'm always, there are times where people walk by the journalism team meetings at night and we're all in there cracking up, and they're always looking in there like, what the hell is going on in there? And it's like, well, we like each other. We understand how hard the job is, but we also have to make sure to balance that out with some camaraderie and levity and all that. So I do think it's, making sure the work environment doesn't feel like you're at a job all the time, which is easier said than done, and certainly easier said than done in a foundation that is in the newsroom right now. So I think in terms of the mental health piece, I think you just got to really be on top of that, and you have to watch closely for signs that somebody needs a break. I mean, my advice for is, You should always take all your vacation time every year. You should never roll over a minute of vacation because human beings need time off. And if you're worried that you can't go on vacation because you're wondering whether the organization can live without you, it can, and at some point it will. So don't deprive yourself of getting away and getting a break when you can, because I think you have to really, and you have to be able to watch people and say, don't come in tomorrow. Don't even put in for a vacation day tomorrow. I can tell you're a little burned out. You need a day off. Just stay on the couch and I'll see you Monday. And so you just have to, it's a lot of it is just instinct and just recognizing when people look different than they usually look in terms of stress. So I think you have to be a much more active manager and a much closer to talking to people as much as you can. I don't mean active manager and micromanaging. I just mean active manager and staying close to your people. That was not a lightning round. I'm sorry.
No, that's perfectly fine. That's good. Do you have a favorite time-saving hack?
Yeah, I got a lot of time-saving hacks. I mean, I categorize my email very aggressively, automatically, but depending on who sends it. That way I can deal with all of the emails we get from grantees at one time. I can deal with all of my calendaring things at one time, all of like that, just because when you're in the mode of dealing with a certain type of an email answer, you can get through 20 of them a lot faster than you just get through whatever 20 emails are at the top of your inbox. So I try to bucket email consumption pretty aggressively so that I can power through categories at a time. And that's, I have friends who will say to me like, oh, I see you finally, I see which category you were focused on yesterday because I got 10 emails from you yesterday. So I try really aggressively to manage email as much as I can. I'm not Duck Lou, who's on our team, likes to brag about being inbox zero. I can't ever say that I really get to that.
I've started asking people about where they live because this is about local news. So next time I come to Miami for Night Media Forum, you have 3 to 5 places you'd recommend or activities?
Yes, El Carajo. It's a great restaurant in the back of a gas station, convenience store, but it's a long-standing Miami staple. Joe's Stone Crabs is always great. The original is down there, and it's a fabulous place to go. These 3 to 5 to go anywhere, or 3 to eat?
Anywhere, or activities, or
yeah. I mean, this guy is a great place to go just to check out a great old mansion right on the water. Big fan of Coconut Grove, which is where the office is, but also Coral Gables. And, we go to Miami Beach sometimes, but I really like just staying more. Oh, you know what a great place to go in town is Wynwood, which is the arts district, which has incredible wall art, graffiti, whatever you want to call it, but an incredible, like every building in Wynwood is just gorgeous and decorated with all sorts of interesting art. And it's a lot of great restaurants and shops. So I'd say Wynwood would be probably the one that's a little more off the beaten path than the others.
And then final question, with apologies to Ezra Klein, 3 to 5 pieces of media, and they don't have to be books, and they could be entertainment or nonfiction news.
12 Angry Men. The movie, original, 1957, still my favorite movie, I think, of all time. Parting the Waters by Taylor Branch on the Civil Rights Movement, fabulous account of that. Moving Pictures by Rush. So if we're talking music, as a child of the 80s, Mark Lavalle on my team will be, he could finally check his bingo card that in any conversation he says I mentioned Rush at least once, so I've done it there now. And in terms of other books, I mean, in terms of just straight up novels, like The Silence of the Lambs, the actual book, Thomas Harris is amazing. But boy, and I guess I'll put this one on there, which will shock everybody, but only because I'm a New York kid and it was my first Broadway show. It's totally off brand for me, but Annie, because I saw Annie as my first Broadway play, which blew my mind that people could get on stage every night and remember all these lines and do it twice a night sometimes. So that experience to me was something, even if I can't say I play the Annie soundtrack very often anymore.
Well, Jim, thank you very much. This has been great.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you for listening to the Local News Matters podcast. Never miss an episode by subscribing in your favorite podcast player and sign up for our newsletter at lnmpod.com. And thanks to our production partners at Pirate Audio. Pirate Audio believes every community deserves great things to listen to, and they're on a mission to help local newsrooms reach their communities via audio. If you're interested in starting a podcast or need production support for an existing one, let me know and I'll be happy to connect you. If you have guest recommendations, others doing interesting and innovative work in local news, let me know through the contact form at the website lnmpod.com.